It's been 84 years.
Well, well, well. We finally have a Rizzley Rerun, the first time ever. And it's been over a year, and in that time, we've had an entire region's worth of content being released, so naturally the big question is, should you get him? Hello everyone, welcome back. I don't have Rizzlord, nor do I personally want him, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get him either. Here's the thing, he plays, as far as I can tell, very similarly to Aloy, and I do play Aloy quite a lot. So, using my experience with Aloy, I want to have a look at whether Rizzley is actually worth pulling in 2025. But first, don't forget to subscribe. I'm back from Japan, which means the video production cycle is back in full swing. We're back, baby. Let's get into it. So hitting that subscribe button and ringing that bell does mean that you'll be notified of the latest videos on the channel. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. As far as I can tell, Rizzley and Aloy share a very similar playstyle. What do I mean by that? Well, basically both these characters use their skill to buff their normal attacks, which are Cryo Infused. That's it. On top of that, they also have an ult that is largely unrelated to the rest of their kit, but it's still some pretty interesting damage nonetheless. There are, of course, some key differences between Rizzley and Aloy. Of course, Rizzley tends to out-damage Aloy, and he also has constellations, which further exacerbated how much he out-damages Aloy. Rizzley is melee range, whereas Aloy is ranged. You know, she's an archer, and her normal attacks are ranged, so there's that. Rizzley's HP also naturally fluctuates as part of his kit, which means he doesn't actually need to use someone like Farina in order to be able to use something like Barra Chaussee. He can just do that by himself. Aloy, on the other hand, has an advantage over Rizzley, which is that her buffs don't actually disappear when you swap her off field for a moment to, let's say, get a Shenhe buff back, whereas Rizzley's buffs disappear from him the moment you swap out from him, so I feel like that can get quite annoying for some Rizzley players who just suddenly need to swap out for whatever reason. Yeah, your buff uptime just disappears like that. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about melt interactions, because they're going to be a little bit different between the two, in the sense that, specifically with their ults, Aloy's ult is one single hit, Rizzley's ult is 5 small hits. And because of Rizzley's ult being 5 small hits, it means that only 2 out of those 5 small hits are going to be melted as part of his standard ICD, whereas Aloy can melt her entire ult. So there's that. Generally speaking, it's not going to make a huge difference, and even damage numbers wise, it still ends up being that Rizzley outdamages Aloy in those kinds of teams. But so long as you don't find yourself in a weird situation where you only have like the tiniest bit of pyro app left on an enemy before you use Rizzley's ult, yeah, you should be fine. All of this to say, because Rizzley and Aloy tends to play similarly enough, that's kind of where my confidence in speaking on a character that I don't actually have pretty much comes from. Because I play a lot of Aloy, I feel like I've already played a fair bit of Rizzley. Released about a year ago, obviously a lot of characters have shown up because it's been a year. And of course, let's just have a look at the key characters that really affect both Rizzley and actually Aloy. So let's start off with Charlotte and Sigvin. They are both really good healers, especially in freeze teams, especially in teams with Farina, because obviously Farina is someone who drains your HP. And speaking of Farina, we also have Farina. who is of course a great off-field hydro option for someone like Rizzley, an alternative to someone like Yelan. Now, that being said though, Furina is not as essential to Rizzley as she is to someone like Aloy, because like I mentioned, Rizzley can already make his HP go up and down, whereas Aloy will need someone like Furina in order to make her HP go down without getting hit. So there is that. Then we have Shen Yun, who enables plunge Rizzley gameplay, which is something that I would actually recommend giving a try at the very least, but it's not something that I would recommend giving a try at all with Aloy. That being said though, one of my Discord community members did show off some funny numbers when it came to plunge Aloy, so it's not entirely out of the question, but it wouldn't be something I would actively go for. And then we also have Eerily, who is a great alternative to Nahida for burn melt teams. You're basically taking away the EM share for more Dendro DPS. Then we have Kachina, who can of course run the scroll set, so that's actually quite useful for her. That being said though, if you decide to run Shilinen instead, then suddenly you have the Kazaha that heals and you actually have no reason to run Kachina in those teams. That being said though, I do want to mention real quick, I feel like Shilinen is slightly more relevant for Rizzley than she is for Aloy, specifically because in Aloy teams, because bomblet grouping is really useful, someone like Kaz still has a reason to be in an Aloy team, and if you happen to have Kaz in an Aloy team, there is a little bit of a less reason to run Shilinen in that Aloy team as well. Because bomblet grouping is not a thing for someone like Rizzley, there is more incentive, I feel like, to run Shilinen in those teams, but you can still try and run Kazaha instead. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting dynamic between those two. Then we have Mawika, the Pyro Archon. And of course, a lot of people think of Mawika as an on-field DPS character. I also want to remind you all that Mawika can be a very useful off-field Pyro applicator. And Mawika's Pyro app with her skill does seem to be more than enough to sustain all the multiple hits of Aloy's normal attack chain, and of course plus her ult. So because that's the case, I would imagine that she can sustain all of Rizzley's relevant meltable damage at the very least, including of course his ult. The main damage that you definitely want to be trying to melt is going to be the big charge attack damage that comes from his passive, I believe, the one that heals. So yeah, if you are able to do that, then yeah, being able to sustain that Pyro Aura is of course going to be very useful. And then finally, I just want to mention real quick Mizuki, who is of course a new character. Allegedly, she can actually group bomblets, but I have not seen that myself, so I'm not entirely sure if she's even all that relevant with regards to Aloy teams, but I'm pretty sure she's not all that relevant at all with regards to Rizzley teams. Now, when it comes to new weapons for Rizzley, the only real new weapon that has come for him since his actual release is of course the Ballad of the Boundless Blue. This of course is a weapon that provides some decent normal attack, charge attack, damage bonuses, but I guess the big question is going to be, do you need that much ER? You don't actually need that much ER or any ER at all when I play Aloy at the very least, so I'm guessing you don't need that much ER when you're running Rizzley. And once again, since his ult is largely not related to the rest of his kit, do you need that much ER? Now, I do want to briefly talk a bit about spoilers, so feel free to mute the video until you start to see color again in this video, so let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about Jensen, who is of course coming in version 5.5, and Jensen can provide a massive attack buff up to 810 attack, so that's going to be really useful since both Aloy and Rizzley are in fact attack scalers, so we do like that. That being said though, the big question is going to be how you're going to be able to maintain that buff, because Jensen's buff apparently requires movement, and I'm not entirely sure how much movement you're going to have when playing with Rizzley. That being said though, whenever I play with Aloy, I tend to run around a fair bit, so I feel like movement with Aloy is probably not going to be the worst thing ever. That being said though, the only way to find out really is to just try out Rizzley and Aloy with Jensen, or at least in my case, Aloy with Jensen. All of this to say, at the end of the day, Rizzley and Aloy are in a pretty interesting position where they have quite a lot of just extra pieces of gear and extra characters to play with, so that you can really just swap and change and mix and match the teams that you want. Speaking of teams, let's get into some teams, because pretty much every Aloy team I play typically translates into a Rizzley team that you can play as well, with a handful of minor adjustments, some of which are going to sound like a running theme. So we have, of course, Aloy, which is a team that I tend to play with, like Shinha, Kaz, Yelan. Rizzley can actually swap Kaz with someone like Shillanen instead. We have the French teams, which in my case is mostly, Mika, Kaz, Farina with Aloy. Whereas Rizzley can, of course, once again swap Kaz with Shillanen, and once again keep in mind, French Aloy is named for that because it's actually kind of important that Farina is in the team, whereas French Rizzley teams, Frizzly teams, if you will, not really a thing, because once again, Rizzley doesn't actually need Farina in order to maintain the Marashose buff. Then, of course, we have Melt teams, which I hear might actually be Rizzley's most popular team at the present moment. So, Melt Aloy tends to run something like Shillanen, Sucrose, Mawika. You can, of course, run the exact same team with Rizzley. If you don't have Mawika, then you can run Dahaya instead. I'm not entirely sure, just as I'm not super duper confident that Mawika can sustain Rizzley's damage, I'm even less sure if Dahaya can sustain Rizzley's damage. So let me know in the comments how you feel about that. Then of course we have Burn Melt teams, where it's basically the same idea as Melt teams, except you basically run Emily or Nahida, and then of course you could potentially run with Aloy, let's say Jean, Nahida, or Emily, I guess, and Dahaya at that point. Rizzley won't need Jean, so at that point you can run Shillanen and Mawika again, so you have some options right there. Then, of course, finally, we also have the Fridge and Hyper Fridge teams for both Aloy and Rizzley. I don't play any of them with Aloy specifically, especially not Hyper Fridge, because you actually don't have any team slots left in order to, let's say, have a Bombler grouper like someone like Kaz. Whereas you can actually play Hyper Fridge Rizzley at least a little bit easier, well, a lot easier actually, because you don't actually need a Bombler grouper. So there's that, but I don't think those teams are all that popular these days. All of this to say, yeah, the teams end up being mostly the same between Aloy and Rizzley, so that's kind of why I feel like me talking about Rizzley is actually not the worst idea ever. Alright, let's talk about Rizzley's build. So pretty much in every team that I mentioned, generally speaking as well, Marashose is pretty much the way to go. As long as you have a good set of Marashose for Rizzley, you don't really need to change at all, especially because Rizzley's HP fluctuation is natural, and so therefore you can just use it regardless. Now, if you're desperate and you're playing freeze and gets freezable enemies, then Blizzard Strayer is a really solid choice. And if you're desperate and you're playing a team where you don't really care about his ult for whatever reason, let's say a Melt team, then Shiminawa ends up being a pretty good alternative as well. And finally, if you're playing a Burn Melt team and you're desperate, then Unfinished Reverie tends to be the solution for that. And when it comes to artifact stats, yeah, generally speaking, attack, cryo, crit is pretty much the way to go. If you're going up against, let's say, a Melt team, then yeah, maybe you can run EM, cryo, crit. Ultimately, it's just going to depend on your substats and as well as your teammates and any other external buffs along the way. Now, with regards to the weapon choices for someone like Rizzley, his best in slot weapon is still going to be his signature weapon, Cash Flow Supervision, also known as the Droid. Meanwhile, the Bell, aka Tulitala's Remembrance, which is Rizzley's weapon, apparently is like so dangerously close to being even better than Cash Flow Supervision that if you happen to have a spare Bell for some reason, then you actually have no real reason whatsoever to go for Cash Flow Supervision itself. Otherwise, if you happen to have Lost Prayer, that seems to be a pretty popular option for him as well. But that's basically the 5-star weapons. The rest of them are basically stat sticks, so just look for any other DPS 5-star weapon and you can go from there. Meanwhile, with regards to the 4-star weapons, Witsith is pretty much the default 4-star weapon for Rizzley. If you don't happen to have an R5 Witsith, then you can actually go for Flowing Purity. Apparently, it is slightly better than a C0 with Sith, but once you get C1 with Sith or higher, then C1 with Sith apparently clears it. I did also mention Ballad of the Boundless Blue. It turns out that it is actually not as good as Flowing Purity, so I guess if you don't want to build a Flowing Purity, but you happen to have a Ballad of the Boundless Blue ready to go, then yeah, I guess if you're desperate enough, you can actually run Ballad of the Boundless Blue instead. And finally, let's have a quick look at Rizzley's constellations. So it seems to me that at the end of the day, you actually don't need any of Rizzley's constellations for him to be absolutely perfectly fine. That being said, though, I do want to put a bit of emphasis on his C1 because I'm still of the sort of potentially outdated opinion that his C1 is still quite, in fact, useful to the point where it is almost important. Let me explain. So at C0, you can actually play Rizzley absolutely perfectly fine to the point where you can even have HP neutral gameplay. The combo that has been recommended on KQM to have combo neutral, HP neutral gameplay is N3CJ, which is N3 charge attack and then do a jump cancel after that. My understanding, and I could be very wrong here, is that when you do N3CJ, every other charge attack, provided you somehow actually do end up below the 60% HP threshold, will heal you. And hopefully every other charge attack will happen within, well, outside of the 5-second cooldown between your healing, which means you get to heal every other charge attack. Hopefully. Let me know in the comments if that's been working out for you. The big difference with something like C1 is that you just have to do 5 normal attacks and you're guaranteed to get a charge attack that can heal you. So that just makes Rizzley so much easier to play with C1. There's also a damage increase in there as well for his charge attacks. C2 means his ult benefits from fully stacking your A4 passive, which actually makes his ult kind of work almost identically to the way you want Aloy's ult to work, where if you're playing a team where you don't need to throw out Aloy's ult for whatever reason, because you're not using, let's say, Thundering Pulse, then you actually want to hold onto your ult until like the last second of your Ice Rush sort of damage percent build up, and then you use your ult for it to do maximum damage. Same idea with C2 and Rizzley's ult. All of a sudden you want to make sure you get all of the stacks of his A4 passive before you use Rizzley's ult so that it does a lot more damage. C3 is normal attack levels, C5 is ult levels. Yeah, they're both more or less useful as well. I think most people might actually prefer it if C5 was skill levels, because that would be a normal attack buff, but it is what it is. Then we also have C4, which is more healing, 50% of Rizzley's health as healing actually for every charge attack, so that's very interesting, as well as additional attack speed. The big question for me is whether C4 Rizzley can actually be played in a Farina team as if he's kind of like Neuvillette, in the sense that you don't need another healer and you can still max out Farina's fanfare stacks. Let me know in the comments how you feel about that. And then finally we have C6, which is big damage and extra crit. It's the standard big damage extra crit constellation. Either way, as far as I can tell, he actually doesn't need his constellation, so you're pretty much good at C0. But on top of that, he does have a rather locked in build ready to go, so really the main choice that you should be making with regards to your Rizzley build is actually just which weapon you have available for him. Alright, let me end this video by actually answering the damn question. Should you get him? Well, if you like him, then yes. If you don't, then no. If you have Aloy, I feel like you have less of a reason to get him. If you don't have Aloy, then I think you have a pretty good reason to go and get Rizley. He is, of course, a pretty solid cryo DPS. But let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below, and please do correct me if I got anything wrong, because, like I said, I don't have him. And some of my understanding of him is coming from third-party sources like my Discord community and as well as KQM. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact content, and until next time, I will see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
True form!